Hi, my name is Ben Runyon for audioskills.com. In another video, I talked a bit about compression in relation to this specific track I'm working on or have worked on and it's going to be released soon called Daydreaming, kind of a tropical housey type of song. And in that video, we talked about compression in relation to the vocals and making sure it was sitting nice in the mix. Now, compression's best friend is EQ. So in this video, I wanted to talk about EQ in relation to that specific vocal track and the master track as well. So let's just dive right into it. If you have ever driven a car or used a home theater system or a boombox or anything like that, you've probably already used an EQ and may not have known it. In the car, you either have a 2 or 3 band EQ, bass treble or bass mids and treble. So when you've used that, you've used it to dial in a sound that is attuned to what your ear likes or what you would like to hear. And that's no different in music production across each individual track and the master track as a whole to shape and curve different parts of the sounds to sit correctly in the space of the mix, in the stereo mix, in that image. So I wanted to dive right into that same song and talk about the vocals first from a parametric sense in that the car EQ that we're talking about where you just see knobs, you don't see a graphical curve. So for that, I brought up a specific plugin that I bought recently from Slate Digital to visualize that. So let's listen to the vocal as is without any EQ on it.
Baby, I'm a dreamer, but this clouds in my mind.
Sounds pretty good. It's at the right volume level, but it doesn't quite have that brilliance and that sheen to cut through the mix. And some of the lower frequencies, you might be able to hear bumping into the mic or some sort of bassy frequency that you don't necessarily need. So I'm going to bring up this plugin I have from Slate Digital called Virtual Mix Rack. And in that, I have a EQ that would look not too dissimilar to something you'd see in your car. So if you want to think about it like this is the sub frequency or the low lows. This would be the low mids, the upper mids, and the highs. So in the car, it might be just 3, low, mid, high. But in this case, we have 4 to be a little bit more specific. So what I'm going for in this song is a radio vocal. And you've probably heard this a lot in pop production. You just didn't maybe know exactly what you were listening to. But basically, they cut most of the lows out of the track. And it has this cool paradoxical effect, or at least to the human ear, of tricking it into thinking that the vocal is in fact brighter. So I'm going to lower both the low frequencies, the sub frequencies of the vocals that we definitely don't need, and some of the lower mid frequencies, and let's see what happens. So before I do anything, let's just play it as is.
Baby, I'm a dreamer.
Okay, let's try to cut that all the way out, the lows.
Baby, I'm a dreamer.
All right, now I'm going to do the lower mids as well.
Baby, I'm a dreamer.
And already you can hear some of that brilliance back. I'm going to push it at the high end a little bit too.
Baby, I'm a dreamer, but there's clouds in my mind.
Sounds pretty good. Let's turn it off and listen again.
Baby, I'm a dreamer.
Turn it on.
Baby, I'm a dreamer.
It's basically night and day. It sounds a lot better the way it is. So let's talk about what I was doing. I cut here, I boosted, and I didn't do anything up here. So these are the controls for the gain of a frequency. And to the left is where that specific frequency is. So in other words, at 100 hertz, I cut 10 decibels. At 600 hertz, I cut about 5 or 4.5 decibels. At 4K, I went up about, 3 decibels. And at 12K, I did nothing. So that's without a visual EQ. Sometimes I like to use EQs like this because when I'm using a graphic equalizer, sometimes I tend to get too specific with frequencies. And when you're listening to stuff over and over with EQ, you have to be mindful that, especially when you're boosting things, you can be really doing a number on your ears. So do make sure to listen to medium to low volume levels, which I currently am right now, I assure you. So I'm going to turn that off, this EQ off, and I'm going to try to accomplish the same thing with a graphic equalizer. So I'm going to turn this bad boy off, and I'm just going to turn the whole thing off actually. And I'm going to put on a channel graphic equalizer. Now the cool thing about the graphic equalizer, especially in the case of Logic, is that it actually has a graphic analyzer down here. So watch what happens.
Baby, I'm a dreamer, but there's clouds in my mind.
There we go.
You
So you can actually see where the frequencies are happening on the frequency range. And up here you have different types of EQs. So you have a low cut, you have a low shelf, notch, 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 high shelf, high cut. In the case of the parametric EQ, or the one that wasn't visual, when I was lowering the lowest knob, it was lowering a low cut. And here you can see at 20 hertz, it has a 24 decibel cut, and the Q is 71. Now the Q is how specific that frequency range is. So I want to cut, let's say, up to 100. So let's listen.
Baby, I'm a dream.
Off.
Baby,
On.
baby,
Nothing's really happening. And the reason why that is,
baby,
as you can see, frequencies aren't really reaching that lower. So I also cut the lower mids with a notch filter, or a shelving filter rather. And that shelving filter, you can see, is very, very general. It will really boost things, or it'll really cut things, but it has a kind of a, it's not a very sharp sword, if you will. It's very indiscriminately big sweeps, either up or down. So let's listen to what happens.
baby, I'm a dreamer.
Again, I'm too low for really anything to happen. So I'm going to take the frequency and set it to about 300 hertz. Now listen.
Baby, I'm a dreamer. But there's clouds in my mind. Your pain is a reliever.
Okay, so now it's starting to take shape a little bit. And I want to compensate a little bit for that by boosting it. Now we're going to deal with the notch filter. Unlike a shelf that has this long languishing shape, or a cut that's very indiscriminate, the notch is very specific about the frequencies it can boost or cut. So let's do a little filter sweep and see what happens.
Baby, I'm a dreamer. But there's clouds in my mind. Your pain is a reliever. 'Cause you see it in mine. You've got that.
Not bad, huh?
Baby, I'm a dreamer. But there's clouds in my mind.
I think that sounds pretty damn good. Let me turn it off and listen.
Baby, I'm a dreamer.
Turn it on.
Baby, I'm a dream.
It's night and day how much better that vocal sounds. So that's on a specific track like the vocals. I could do the same thing with the drums. Let me find these things first. So let's see where my drums are. Did I have a drum loop down here? Did I do the kick snare thing? There, I think it's this guy. Yeah, I think it's this guy right here.
But there's
So in the case of the drums, I think that I have an EQ on it. So let's listen. I think the only thing I did here was try to bring out some of the crispy frequencies of that hat and snare. So without it, with it on, and you can see if I wanted to, I could try to increase the bass, lower the bass. So going a little bit further, one of my biggest mixing philosophies is, when working on a song, is soloing things together. Listen to the drum kit. Does it sound good? All right, now solo it with the bass. Do the drums and the bass now sound good together? Great. How about the drums, the bass, and the vocals? Oh no, they don't sound good together. So the culprit must be the vocals. When using this process of elimination in your mixes and using EQ and compression, you can start to dig out a hole for everything in the mix so that there's a main focal point and secondary and other focal points in the song that play a support role to that main focal point, which is usually the vocal in a song. So I promised you I'd show you a little bit about the master track. I don't do this much, and in fact, it doesn't really look like I had an EQ on this final master track, and I might have waited till the mastering process to do that. But just to show you for a second, let's pretend that I put an EQ on the master track for a moment, just to kind of show you what it would do. Got my analyzer on, visualizing the entire thing. So I could boost, get those big frequencies out of that. Now let's unsolo it.
But there's clouds in my mind. But there's clouds in my mind.
I'm lucky that I mixed this song well enough to not have to do too many radical things on the master fader to eliminate bad frequencies. Now, when I'm talking about bad frequencies, there might be some shrill stuff in here. So this is what I mean. There might be some really hissy noise in this song that I might like to get rid of. So let's take that, for instance. And what I always do is I boost the nasty stuff first to find it, and then I pull it out. So let me try to find something that's maybe a little bit nasty. That's bad. We don't like that at all. Now, that was a very broad stroke. If I were to just simply pull that down, it could take out a lot of good things too. So let me make my cue more specific to see if I can find that ugly frequency. I think that's it. You can hear this awful whistle. So let me cue it a little bit more. Okay, that's probably it. So I can try to pull that out. And let me start by just bringing it back to 0 where it was and then kind of bring it down so I don't do too much. And maybe I want to compensate a little bit by boosting the highs. All right, so let's listen to that little loop without it on. With it on. I think a little bit cleaner and a little bit better. So that's our conversation today about EQ. Obviously, I didn't touch on every single thing about EQ, but this should give you a good starting point to begin to experiment in your digital audio workstation of choice. The number one thing that I always recommend is, especially with EQ, is move knobs around. You'll train your ears to know what sounds good and what doesn't. Also, take rest breaks. You have to rest your ears or you will not know what you're mixing and your ears will be lying to you. You've got to know when to walk away from the track and when to take a break and listen to something else. And the third thing would be A and B. Always A and B your track. Listen to a track that you're trying to replicate in terms of its audio and stereo content, not necessarily music, but its timbre or audio aesthetic, and A and B it against your track. Are you getting the sounds that you want? EQ is what's going to help you start to shape a lot of these choices. It can be the line right before a compressor and a limiter in a final track that can do the final shaping on a track, or in the case of individual instruments, carve out its space so that it can fit better amongst other items. This has been Ben Runyon for audioskills.com. Thanks for watching the video, and please stay tuned.